joined this morning by President Obama's Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough. Dennis, thanks so much for being here. It's quite a thing to have you here on the last Sunday of the Obama presidency.
I appreciate very much the chance to be with you, Jake.
So let me ask you, there are now at least 18 House Democrats who are boycotting the Trump inauguration. Does President Obama think that's appropriate, or does he think they should follow his lead and attend for the sake of honoring the office and the peaceful transfer of power?
Well, the president has made very clear since the election that we should do everything in our power in this transition period to make sure that the next president and his team are up and ready to go. In fact, on Tuesday night in his speech, he called him the freely elected president of the United States. So that's the charge that we've taken. By the same token, these Democrats and others have pointed out that they've got significant concerns. And we've found some of those concerns. The intelligence shows that the Russians did intervene. They did intervene with the purpose of helping one candidate and hurting the other. So these are by no means trivial concerns. So my hope would be that the president-elect will reach out to somebody as consequential and as somebody who is such a leader as John Lewis, who has done so many things over the course of his life, to try to work this out. And hopefully not just reach out to him, but pursue some of the policies that Mr. Lewis has literally fought, bled, and gone to jail for over the course of his remarkable life. And that would be the kind of thing that would not only send a message to the American people that we're prepared to work together, but would also send a message to the Russians that we are united. Their efforts to divide us, to weaken us, to advance their own interest at the expense of ours are going to fail.
But just to be clear, though, President Obama thinks that President-elect Trump is legitimate.
The president has made very clear that he believes that he is the freely elected president. He will be inaugurated on Friday, and he will come into office, hopefully strengthened by the kind of transition that we've tried to run in this White House.
As somebody who saw his own legitimacy questioned repeatedly as President Obama, including by the incoming president-elect, Donald Trump, with that birther nonsense, does he think that Democrats should put this away, this whole idea of legitimate, illegitimate?
The president's not going to get in the middle of this right now. I think what ultimately the President-elect Trump's success will be determined by his ability to implement the kinds of policies and to have the kind of success that we've had over the course of this administration. Take one of the issues that I think he mentions over the course of the last several days, which is crime. Crime is down. Crime is way down. In fact, crime is down at the same time that the prison populations in this country are down. That's the first time that's ever happened. So we feel very good about the progress that we've made over the course of these 8 years, and we hope that the next president will continue a lot of those policies that have resulted in that progress.
Michael McFaul, who was President Obama's ambassador to Russia, put out a tweet this weekend that I want to show you. He wrote, quote, "It is unusual for transition teams to have contact with foreign governments. The number of calls to Kislyak, which was Russia's ambassador to the U.S., during the Obama transition was zero." This is a specific reference to President-elect Trump's incoming national security advisor, Mike Flynn, reaching out to the Russian ambassador several times on and around the day that the Obama White House announced new sanctions and punishments against Russia. Do you have any concerns about those calls and attempts to reach out by Mike Flynn?
Well, Josh was asked about this on Friday, Jake, and I think he answered it just right, which is to say, fact is, the content of the calls is what matters. We have pursued a policy throughout the course of this transition, which is the one that we pursued when we were coming in 2008, which is there's one president at a time. That's important so that the American people know exactly what to expect, and it's also important so that our adversaries are not confused by what we intend to do, by what the United States' position is, and about the significance of our feeling or our intentions on some particular issue.
Do you have any knowledge of what the content of the call was?
I don't.
Are you concerned at all that it was, don't worry about these sanctions, we will undo them when we get into office?
I'm not going to get into any particular concerns, but I do think that the content matters, and we'll see how that shakes out.
About 9 days ago, you were in the room when President Obama and Vice President Biden were briefed by the top intelligence officials in the country about not just the intelligence community report on the Russian hacking, but also that addendum, that annex, the two-page synopsis about that former MI6 British officers' memos. I know you're not going to get into the content, but Vice President Biden confirmed that that synopsis was there. And the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, tried to explain it in a statement. He said, part of our obligation is to ensure that policymakers are provided with the fullest possible picture of any matters that might affect national security. Do those matters affect national security, or do you agree with President-elect Trump that this is a political witch hunt by the intelligence community trying to hurt him?
Look, the president thought it was very important to ask for this assessment of what precisely happened in our election in 2016, but not just in 2016, also in 2012 and in 2008, two elections that he stood in. And in fact, in 2008, as you know, Jake, and as everybody knows, we were also hacked at that time.
But nothing was released.
Nothing was released. The point is, it's important for the president, it was important to the president, that we get a full and complete assessment from the intelligence community so that we could brief that to policymakers who would stay here and the incoming policymakers so that they can come up with policy and implement that policy to ensure this doesn't happen again. We think we got that from the IC in this case.
But about the synopsis, do you think that including that was the intelligence community trying to mess with Donald Trump, trying to get uncorroborated rumors out there in a sneaky way?
I have no, look, the intelligence community is staffed by an unbelievable cadre of professionals who have dedicated their lives and in many cases put their lives at risk to get really critical, timely, and important information to policymakers. I have no reason to believe that they pursued this tasking, this assignment with anything but the most straightforward professional goals in mind.
Are you at all concerned that the Russians have something on Donald Trump?
Look, the job description of chief of staff is to be concerned and to worry about things. But the thing that we're worried about right now is to make sure that the incoming team has all the information, all the readiness, all the preparation that they need, that they can hit the ground running at 12:01 on Friday after the president is inaugurated here, and they take over.
I recognize that your hands are kind of tied as to what you can say, but you didn't deny that you were concerned.
Look, I'm paid to be concerned about everything, Jake, and that's my job description. That's what I do, and that's what I'll continue to do until 12:01 on Friday.
A big part of the Obama legacy, of course, is the Affordable Care Act. Republicans have already started the process of repealing it. President Obama has told Democrats, don't rescue Republicans on Obamacare, make them own it, start calling it Trump Care. Given how many Americans depend upon the Affordable Care Act and what will come next, shouldn't Democrats try to make it as good as possible?
Well, I'm not sure I know what that quote is. I think that's referring to a leak or a second-hand characterization of what the president said. Here's what I know what the president believes and what the president has said to me, which is that the Affordable Care Act is important to the American people. This isn't a political question. This is 24 million people who now have access to health care because of that act. We also have seen historically low cost increases in healthcare costs over the course of the last 4 years, year on year on year on year. That's something that we have not seen happen since we started keeping score on these matters.
But premiums have gone up. Premiums have gone up.
Premiums go up and down, Jake, as a matter of course in healthcare. That's what we call the market. And in fact, what we've seen over the course of time is, over the course of these last 4 years, historically low cost increases. That's even when you consider out-of-pocket costs like deductibles or copays. That is a fact. That's undeniable. And that's what the president is focused on. The politics will work themselves out. Okay? What won't work themselves out is 24 million people or the 320,000 people who would get coverage in North Carolina under the expanded Medicaid plan of Governor Cooper, which was put on hold last night by a federal judge. What won't happen is those 320,000 people won't get health care, won't get the peace of mind that you and I have, that all 435 of these people have, and that everybody in the administration has when they get health care coverage at the cost of the American taxpayer. That's what the American people deserve, and it would be a shame, an absolutely shame, if this Congress and this next incoming administration doesn't recognize that fact.
You mentioned the intelligence professionals who will still be here after President Obama and his administration leave. There are going to be a lot of bureaucrats and people who work in policy who are remaining here. The Trump transition team has sent out questionnaires to a lot of them. How many of you and who has worked on climate change, who has worked on gender issues? What do you make of that? These are still your employees, technically.
Well, these are the American people's employees. The American people pay them. The American people expect professionalism from them, expect results from them, and that's in the main what they get. We were very concerned about these reports, Jake. We've raised them. A number of us have raised them with the transition team and with the president-elect's team. We've sought and we've received assurances that that was not sanctioned activity and that, in fact, that they think it's a bad idea. So we are relieved to hear that. We think that the American people will be relieved to hear that. And we think that the federal workforce should be relieved to hear that. And we'll make sure that we conduct our business just that way until 12:01 on Friday.
There's still an FBI probe going on with the Clinton Foundation. Senator Sessions the other day during his confirmation hearing said as Attorney General he would recuse himself from anything having to do with the Clintons, which suggests there's still stuff going on. Is there any discussion right now by President Obama about any sort of preemptive pardon for Bill or Hillary Clinton?
I don't know anything about any investigations, and I don't have anything on pardons, preemptive or otherwise.
How about for Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning?
Also, don't like if the president is going to exercise any pardons, it'll be conducted straightforwardly, pursuant to our policies, and we'll make those decisions based on the merits, not on the politics of any particular matter.
Dennis, you've been with President Obama since he was Senator Obama, giving him advice and then joining his campaign. So what is your favorite one-on-one memory you ever had with them?
The beauty about my one-on-one memories, Jake, is that they'll stay that. I've valued my candid relationship with the president, the fact that he gives me some good advice, including on how to be a good dad. That's stuff that I'll take with me, maybe share with my wife, but nobody else. I will say that the thing I'm most proud of, Jake, is an administration now acknowledging that we still have 6 days left or 5 days left. That has been historically free of scandal. And I think that's important, not just because it underscores the president and his and the First Lady, Dr. Biden, Vice President Biden's view on how the government should run and how we should conduct ourselves, but it's also because we set out a White House that said the institutions have to work. Congress is going to investigate us. They did. We participated in and cooperated with those investigations. Department of Justice
Some would take
needs
issue
to,
with that, just FYI.
well, I'm sure they will. And my point, though, is, Jake, is they ought not let down their guard on the importance of the Article I institution, Congress, overseeing the Article II institution, the president. By the same token, we've let the Department of Justice, the FBI, the courts do their business, and we've not intervened in that. The independence and transparency of that process is very important to the functioning of this democracy. The president's been clear about that with us from day one, and that's why, God willing, we'll leave here on 12:01 Friday with that president's record intact. That's an important thing. That underscores the confidence of the American people in the institutions at a time when that sometimes seems in question.
Most White House chief of staffs last, what, 2 years, year and a half?
Well, there's been great ones. Andy Card lasted 5.5 years.
What, you were 4?
Not yet.
Not
If I
yet.
make it till Friday. I serve at the pleasure, Jake, so let's see if I can make it.
You think you're going to get fired before then?
I just might. I don't know.
You never
Have
know.
seen
It's up
this?
to the discretion of the president. Dennis McDonough, thank you so much for being
Thanks,
here.
Jake.
Really
I appreciate the
it.
chat.